Good evening. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is my weekly internet show. Now, let me read you an excerpt from an article in today's New York Times, and let me ask you to guess what country they're talking about. On Friday, in a dangerous escalation, riot police officers attacked a rally, injuring its leader. Every night, protesters march and clashes erupt in a violent standoff that often seems a breath away from an explosion. Now, who do you think they're talking about there? Syria? Egypt? No, they're actually talking about Bahrain. And you might say, well, that's impossible, Jacob. This is a U.S. supported ally. This is a partner. The U.S. has a military base there. We've trained their troops. We've funneled millions of dollars into their regime. How can they be attacking protesters? Well, the answer is because the U.S. government has long supported dictators and dictatorships, especially in the Middle East, but also in Latin America. In fact, the title of this article pretty much encapsulates what we've been saying at the Future of Freedom Foundation for some 22 years now. The title is this: As hopes for reform fade in Bahrain, protesters turn anger on United States. Now, you might say, but wait a minute. Why are they turning their anger on the United States? What did the United States do, with respect to Bahrain? Well, I'll tell you what it did. It supported the dictatorship there, and it continues to support the dictatorship. It embraces the dictatorship. It's financially supported it. It's trained its troops. It's supplied weaponry. And that's what has made the dictatorship so powerful. Now, it wasn't so powerful that it was able to suppress the protests that arose. And so it had to turn to another dictatorship that is a U.S. ally. Now, I don't know whether the U.S. was behind this. It wouldn't surprise me. The CIA, the military-industrial complex, or whatever. But we do know that Saudi Arabia, another of the U.S.-supported dictatorships, all of a sudden sent troops several months ago into Bahrain to help the Bahrain dictatorship oppress the people there, kill the protesters. I think they killed around 60 peaceful protesters. And they're still there, as far as I know. And so people are figuring it out there. The government is so powerful militarily that the people can't stand up against it. They know that this government will undoubtedly just continue shooting protesters and so forth. And so they're starting to figure out, how did this dictatorship, how did this regime become so powerful? How did it acquire the weaponry, the bullets, the tear gas, the concussion grenades? How did it do this? And they're starting to figure out that it has been the U.S. government that has been doing this for the Bahrain dictatorship for years. And of course, none of this is new. I've talked about it here on my show. I've written about it. The situation in Egypt is another example. That there you've got a situation where the military is in charge, and it won't relinquish its control over the Egyptian people. It's wielding the same kind of powers that President Obama has been wielding and President Bush wielded after 9/11, the powers to arrest people, round them up, torture them, even execute them after some sort of kangaroo military tribunal. And that's the kind of system that exists in Egypt, and it has for decades. How did the Egyptian dictatorial regime get so powerful with tanks and airplanes and weaponry and so forth? The U.S. government. I mean, just recently, the Department of State said, hey, we're going to send another $1.3 billion to this dictatorship. And of course, some members of Congress are raising, protests now because of the military has dissolved the parliament, didn't like the results of the vote. They're insisting that the military remain in charge in Egypt, because you see, the military there is just as influential as the military here. It is a powerful oligarchy entailing thousands and thousands of people. Nobody really knows, what the budget is, how many people, how many commercial enterprises they have, because it's all secret. The people are not entitled to this information because the military is in charge, and it runs hotels and it runs restaurants and so forth. But nobody really knows the extent of this thing. But the military has said, regardless of who is elected president, regardless of who's elected to the parliament, they will answer to us. We are the Supreme Council. We are the national security state. We exist to protect national security, and therefore we will be in charge, and the president and the legislature will answer to us. We will let them know what their powers are. Well, this is not a free society. This is a dictatorship. And how is it that it is so powerful? Because the U.S. government has been providing the weaponry for decades, the money to buy the weaponry. You see, it's sort of a welfare payment to the arms industry here in the United States. And as most everyone knows, the U.S. government is the biggest arms purveyor in the world, and sometimes arming both sides. And so that what they do, though, instead of just sending a welfare payment to the arms industry, they send the welfare payment to the Egyptian military dictators. They take their cut, line their pockets, put it in their Swiss bank accounts, and then there's enough money there to handle the contracts for the purchase of weaponry, tanks, planes, bullets, and so forth from the U.S. arms industry. So it's a nice little fascistic type partnership between government and the arms industry, but in order to make it look like it's free enterprise, they send the welfare payment to the Egyptian regime. Well, people are finally starting to figure out that it's the U.S. government and its foreign policy that is behind the strength of the dictatorships that people cannot oust from power. They're too powerful. They got tanks and planes and guns. And of course, in these countries, they have gun control. So the citizenry don't have the means of violently overthrowing the government. And so they're practically sitting ducks. Let me give you an example of this from this article. It says that, let me see. Here's a man like Ali, 22-year-old guy, a resident of the island, are shaking their chairs. Several months back, during an anti-government protest, he lost an eye to a concussion grenade fired by the police. After he was fitted with a glass eye, he quickly returned to the streets. This is Bahrain. He said he had no intentions of stopping now. Until they fall, he said. Now, how did they get that concussion grenade? I have absolutely no doubts that this is part of that foreign aid that the U.S. government has long provided the Bahrain dictatorship. And they have to be nice to the dictatorship because the U.S. military maintains a base in this country run by a tyrannical regime. Now let me stop there and talk about tyranny. Traditionally and historically, Americans have opposed tyranny, tyrannical governments. I mean, this was our revolution here was born in resistance to the tyranny of the colonists' own government. We often stop to think that, the British were a foreign power, that were defeated in the Revolutionary War. Nonsense. This was a revolution by British citizens. They were revolting against the tyranny of their own government. And make no mistake about it, these dictatorships are tyrannical governments, tyrannical regimes. Now, what does that tyranny entail? Not just economic oppression, the high taxation, the privileges of government officials. Some of them are monarchies, or even if they're not monarchies, they're treated like kings and they have courts and so forth. But not just that, but it's the civil liberties aspect. The power to just go out and seize people, especially people that are criticizing the regime, and carting them away, torturing them, and killing them. That's the essence of tyranny. Those of you that have been listening to this show for a long time know that there's no doubt in my mind that the greatest power that a tyrannical regime can ever possess is not the power to impose a socialist system, not the power even to confiscate guns. It's the power to go out and just arrest anybody they want, cart them away to a military dungeon or a concentration camp, and torture them, keep them there forever without a trial, or execute them after some sort of kangaroo tribunal. Well, that's the essence of tyranny. That's a tyrannical regime. And these dictatorships are the very equivalent of tyranny. The Egyptian military, it's a military dictatorship. It's no different from, say, the Pinochet dictatorship, where Pinochet killed some 3,000 people that were like threats to national security. Did he have trials for them? Oh, no. No, they were communists, he said. And that entitled him and his goons to just go out and arbitrarily kill people, including 2 Americans. They killed 2 Americans that they said were communists, you see, because they were liberals. They had leftist ideology, and they happened to have discovered that the U.S. government was playing a role in that revolution in Chile. And of course, it later came out that the CIA had participated in the murder of at least one of these men. No, nobody was brought to justice. The Justice Department wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. The Congress wouldn't touch it because it's the CIA. And so despite the fact that the State Department admitted that the CIA had played a role in that dictatorial regime's murder of 2 Americans, or at least 1 American, but probably both of them, U.S. government wouldn't touch it, and the courts wouldn't touch it, and so forth. Well, this is the essence of dictatorial regimes, especially the military ones. I mean, it's just like equal. Military dictatorships equals tyranny. And the U.S. government has been one of the most ardent supporters of tyranny. Egypt's a good example. And you've got now the Bahrain situation. I mean, get this. They recently... the Bahrain government recently convicted some physicians of helping some of the protesters who were injured. Imagine that. Convicted them and gave them long jail terms. Now, recently, in response to pressure, including from the U.S. government, the Bahrain government said, okay, we'll lower the sentences. I mean, but you see this immoral, evil symbiotic relationship. The U.S. government helps the Bahrain government become powerful, weaponry, money, and so forth. And then they use that power to maintain what they call, and what U.S. officials call, order and stability, or to preserve national security, which means preserving the dictatorship. Then they use the weaponry to oppress, kill people that are resisting tyranny. And then the U.S. says, well, wait a minute, we're not going to give you money, or we're going to suspend your aid because you shouldn't be so mean to protesters. But the U.S. can't be too forceful about it because they got a military base there. I mean, what happens if the Bahrain dictatorship says, out of here? Sort of like the Ecuadorian government said. The Ecuadorian government said, no, I'm sorry. Well, it was Ecuador or Bolivia that said, out of here. I think it was Ecuador that said, out of here, no more American bases unless we, the Ecuadorians, can have a base in the United States. And of course, the U.S. position is, we're not going to allow any foreign military bases in the United States. Well, Ecuador says, well, then why should we allow a foreign military base here in Ecuador? And that's the same thing with Bahrain. I mean, and the Bahrain people are starting to figure this out. As I say, the title of the article is Protesters Turn Anger on the United States. And this is what we've been arguing at the Future of Freedom Foundation long before 9/11, that it's U.S. foreign policy that is creating the anger and the hatred that ultimately manifests itself in terrorist attacks. We saw that with the terrorist attacks on the USS Cole, the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center, the terrorist attacks outside CIA headquarters, where that guy was out there. Remember, several years ago, there was a guy that was shooting CIA officials as they were turning into CIA headquarters. He was just walking along there on the road, on Route 123. They were just shooting people in their cars. because he was angry over this type of thing taking place in the Middle East. And this is what's been going on for decades. I mean, this financial support of dictatorships, this embrace of dictatorships. I mean, this is why it's so ironic or hypocritical, whatever label you want to put on it, that the U.S. is over there protesting against the Assad regime. Why, this is just terrible that the Assad regime is suppressing its protesters and its citizens that are resisting tyranny. Well, yeah, it is horrible. I mean, dictatorships are horrible. But the irony and the hypocrisy is that here the U.S., is over there supporting the Bahrain dictatorship as it kills its people. It's doing nothing different from what the Syrian government's doing. And the Egyptian government's no different. Well, we don't know where that Egyptian situation is going to end up, but I guarantee you, if the Egyptian people, say no, we're not going to tolerate this military supremacy. That's not a free society. We're going to subordinate the military to civilian control. And if the military stands steadfast and says, we're essential to national security, we've got to be in charge here, there's going to be some violence. And that violence is going to be manifested by troops and police that have been armed by the U.S. government through billions and billions of dollars. And what's the rationale of that? Oh, national security, order and stability. Let me see if I can find where this guy says, and he's just blunt about it, this U.S. official. He said, let me see, the protesters are burning American flags. A young man held up a sign reading, "The American administration supports the dictatorship in Bahrain." This is coming from the protesters. And this is what one of the Obama administration officials said. Now, this pretty much says it all. Maintaining our and our partners. Now, by partners, they're talking about dictatorships. That the U.S. makes partners with dictators. Okay. Maintaining our and our partners' ability to respond to security challenges is an important component of our commitment to Gulf security. Okay, so it's national security, it's order and stability. And so they make these partnerships with these dictatorships. And that even in Syria, see where they're making this big fuss about, the Syrian dictatorship. And well, you know what that's all about? It's all about that the Assad administration, Assad being the dictator, he's not our dictator. The Bahrain dictator is our dictator. The Saudi dictator is our dictator. The Egyptian dictator is our dictator. The Syrian dictatorship is not our dictator. Now, that's not to say that he once wasn't our dictator. He was. The guy in Syria, Assad, was once our dictator. Now, you may find that hard to believe because, President Bush, the first President Bush used to say, we don't talk to the Assad regime. We don't talk to the Assad regime. Well, then it turns out that that somehow or another, the U.S. enters into a rendition torture partnership with the Assad regime. And I mean, it's just amazing. They kidnap a guy from Canada who was switching planes at Dulles Airport. U.S. officials do. They just kidnap him. There's no other way to put it. And they try to get him to confess to being a terrorist. He's a Canadian citizen. He used to be a citizen of Syria. So they said, well, we're going to send you to Syria. And he says, I'm not a Syrian citizen anymore. I'm a Canadian citizen. Tough luck. And so they cut a deal with the Syrian dictatorship to torture this guy. They put him in a cell the size of a coffin. They tortured him brutally. Get this, for a full year. He's in this coffin-like cage for a year. They torture the heck out of the guy. And the guy would never confess because it turns out he was innocent. The CIA was wrong. They were just flat out wrong that this guy was a terrorist. I mean, it goes to show you one of the faults and failures and fallacies of the torture system. There's always a possibility that you're going to get somebody innocent. And you keep torturing and torturing and torturing them, waterboarding them 58 times or whatever because you're convinced they're guilty. You're just waiting for that confession to come. This guy never confesses. It turns out he's totally innocent. And finally, the Syrians, to their credit, they released the guy. But my question is how come we never learned the details of this partnership? Now, we hear Hillary Clinton talking about the dictatorship in Syria, how brutal it is, and it is. It's a brutal dictatorship. The people there have every right in the world to protest, to oust this regime. I mean, it's resistance to tyranny. But this was a tyrannical regime that the U.S. partnered with, just like it partnered with Bahrain, just like it partnered with the Saudis, just like it partners with the Egyptian dictatorship. How did that partnership get arranged? We don't know. They won't tell us. The CIA isn't talking. They're keeping it totally secret, national security, state secrets, even though the Syrian regime obviously knows how the partnership got struck. But, did the president sign off on it? Did it get negotiated? What were the terms of the torture rendition partnership? We're not permitted to know any of this. The mainstream press has never asked any questions, has never demanded answers. Congress has never demanded answers. It's just like, hey, put it behind us. What's done is done. Well, it's this type of thing that is the height of immorality in the U.S. government. I mean, this is one of the primary issues that we should be debating here in the United States. Is should the United States government be supporting and partnering with dictatorships? Now, I think it should even be bigger than that. That should the U.S. government, the U.S. empire, be engaged in supplying foreign regimes with money and armaments? The so-called foreign aid, which is like a welfare payment to military dictators or democracies or whatever. It's a way to buy their loyalty. And all it does is create problems. As we can see now, you got Bahrain people that are now angry at the United States. And as their dictatorship starts to kill more people, the anger is going to just rise. And the same thing in Egypt. If there's a violent revolution there, you can bet your bottom dollar that much of that anger is going to be directed toward the United States because our government will have been the one that furnished the weaponry and the cash to these dictatorships in the name of national security and order and stability, which, by the way, is the primary rationale that these dictators have for wielding these emergency powers where they can take people into custody and torture them and execute them and so forth without trials. In fact, guess who convicted these doctors in Bahrain? Now, you might say, oh, well, they must have had a federal court trial. No, they copied the United States. It's military tribunals that convicted these guys. It's essentially the same thing that the U.S. does. Now, I don't know who copied who in terms of these kind of powers, the powers to take citizens into custody as military enemy combatants and torture them. The doctors were tortured. They're all saying they were tortured there and before they were convicted and sentenced. But it was all, rubber stamped with approval by military tribunals. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? Guantanamo Bay, military tribunals, enemy combatants, the power to take Americans into custody like they did in the Jose Padilla case, torture them, hold them as long as they want, and Bill of Rights is out the window. Doesn't count. Supreme Court won't get involved. The Supreme Court's not about to touch the military or the CIA. They have omnipotent power to do whatever they want. This is not what America is all about. Is this the kind of system that our founding fathers envisioned? Is this the kind of system that the framers envisioned when they brought the federal government into existence? A regime that uses the Internal Revenue Service to extract wealth out of the pockets of suffering Americans. I mean, Americans are having a hard time making ends meet. And the IRS takes a large chunk of their money to send it to these dictatorships. Oh, in the name of national security and maintenance of order and stability. Well, this is just nonsense. This is just absolute nonsense. And, if the money and the armaments had a neutral effect, I mean, even that would be bad because it's really no different from any other welfare payment. But it has an absolutely negative effect because of this anger the hatred that starts developing against the facilitator of the weaponry, the one that has supported the dictatorship in the name of order and stability and national security. Um, that's why we libertarians have to continue raising people's vision to a higher level. You know, conservatives will say, okay, well, maybe the system needs reform. And the liberals will say, okay, maybe the system needs reform. I mean, we see this domestically all the time. You see it in the healthcare crisis. You know, however way the Supreme Court rules in the healthcare debate, you know, the answer is always going to be the system needs reform. Well, we libertarians have to carry, you know, things to a higher level. We need to you know, change our form of government here to such an extent that the government doesn't have the power to send foreign aid to dictators and dictatorships or to anyone, and leave that money in the pockets of the American people. You see, the government, including the national security state here, you know, the CIA, the giant military-industrial complex, they look at their great big empire overseas, you know, their regime change operations, their coups, their assassinations, their military bases in Bahrain and all the other, you know, 130 countries, some 1,000 military bases overseas, is that's a demonstration of American friendship, you know, through demonstrating by exemplifying military power, we're out making friends. Well, this is ludicrous because it doesn't make any friends. They've got the system all screwed up. You know, then they isolate the American people in a real form of isolation. They won't let us, you know, like trade and travel with the Cuban people because their little national security state embargo. They're still concerned about the communists coming to get us, you know, from Cuba, even though, you know, they don't have the same embargo against North Vietnam or South Vietnam or North Korea. And I mean, it's ridiculous. You know, China, I mean, there's essentially friendly relations with a communist regime there. And yet with Cuba, Americans are isolated. So libertarians, we need to carry this debate forward on a much higher level, a transformation of American life, where the government is reined in and the American people are liberated. You see, let the American private sector be the demonstration of friendship and peace and harmony in the world. Free the American people to travel and trade to Iran, North Korea, China, Cuba, Vietnam, wherever, you know, in whatever country that you know, recognize freedom of movement and freedom of trade are fundamental God-given rights. But rein in the military empire. Stop all the foreign aid, including the ones to the dictators. Dismantle the military empire. Close all those bases. All they do is just make people angry. The same thing they would make Americans angry if all those foreign countries had military bases over here. And so we've got to take things to a higher level. And especially in today's times. I mean, we all know what the economic conditions are, right? You've got a national debt that's soaring out of control because of government spending. And all you hear from the liberals is tax the rich, tax the rich, tax the rich. Well, you know, that only reaches a certain point. At some point, you run out of rich. I mean, like in Greece. And so, you know, taxing is not the solution to this. It's how to stop the spending juggernaut. And already they're talking about increasing the debt ceiling again. In other words, more massive debt on top of the American people. What better time than now to raise people's vision to a higher level and say, enough's enough. We're creating anger and enmity against our nation with this foreign aid, be it in Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, wherever. Stop supporting these dictators. Leave people alone there. Okay, they're obviously suffering under brutal dictatorships. Don't strengthen the dictatorships. Just leave things alone and leave it to the citizens of that country to figure out what best to do about it. But when the U.S. government becomes an active player in these countries by funneling arms and tanks and weaponry, the tyranny is only going to get worse. So we libertarians, we subscribe to strong moral principles, strong economic principles. We've got to raise this debate to a higher level. Discard this notion of reform, reform, reform. We've got to raise people's vision to a higher level where we talk about freedom and the free market and prosperity and a constitutionally limited republic. That's the show. Thanks so much for listening in, and I'll talk to you all next week. Good night.